The sheriff reached for the cuffs, and the entire street of Dry Creek fell silent, because everyone knew Clara Whitmore had done nothing wrong. The morning sun hung low over the dusty main road, turning every boardwalk and wagon wheel the color of old brass, and in the middle of it all stood Clara Whitmore with her hands calm at her sides, while Sheriff Howard Pike stared at her like he'd already made up his mind long before that morning ever came. The town had gathered the way small towns always do when something unusual begins to unfold. A ranch hand paused beside the hitching rail, the barber leaned halfway out his shop door, and a wagon driver slowed his horses until the leather reins creaked softly in the warm wind coming off the prairie. Clara didn't look afraid. Her green-brown eyes were steady, and the freckles across her sun-touched cheeks caught the light like tiny grains of sand after a long trail ride. She wore a cream prairie blouse beneath a fitted brown vest, and dust from the long road outside town still clung faintly to the hem of her skirt, the kind of dust that only comes from land 20 miles out where the grass grows tall and the wells run deep. Sheriff Pike adjusted the silver star pin to his chest, as if the badge itself had already decided the matter. "Clara Whitmore," he said slowly so the entire street could hear him, "you're being taken in for illegal claim of ranch land." A few people shifted uncomfortably. Everyone in Dry Creek knew Clara had paid honest money for that spread north of the creek, bought it from an old widow who could no longer keep cattle through the winter. But knowing something and saying something were two very different things in a town where the sheriff had ruled for nearly 10 years. Two deputies stepped forward, boots thudding softly against the sun-baked dirt. Clara glanced once toward the horizon beyond the buildings, where the prairie rolled away for miles like an ocean of dry grass. Then she spoke in a voice so calm it almost felt out of place in the tension of the moment. "Sheriff," she said, "you know that land was sold fair." Pike gave a thin smile that never reached his eyes. "What I know," he answered, "is that Dry Creek has rules." A breeze pushed down the street, carrying the smell of horses, leather, and distant sagebrush. At the far edge of the boardwalk, leaning quietly against a weathered post outside the saloon, stood a tall cowboy most people barely noticed at first. His dusty, sand-colored duster hung loose over broad shoulders, and the brim of a worn brown Stetson cast a shadow across a rugged face marked by trail years and one distinct scar cutting across his left eyebrow. Elias Carter had been there the entire time. He hadn't said a word. His gray-blue eyes moved slowly from the sheriff to Clara and back again. One gloved hand rested calmly on the railing while the other hung near the pocket of his coat, where something small pressed faintly against the fabric. Sheriff Pike nodded to his deputies. The metal cuffs glinted in the sunlight as one of them stepped forward. A murmur spread through the crowd. Clara Whitmore lifted her chin slightly, not in defiance, but in quiet certainty, and for the first time her eyes flicked toward the silent cowboy across the street, as if she already knew something the rest of Dry Creek did not. Elias Carter finally pushed himself off the wooden post and stepped down onto the dusty street, his boots landing slow and steady, and though he still hadn't spoken a single word, the way he walked toward the sheriff made more than a few people suddenly realize this morning in Dry Creek was not going to end the way Sheriff Pike expected. Boot heels pressed softly into the dust as Elias Carter crossed the street, each step slow enough that the sound of leather and grit carried farther than any shouted warning ever could, and for reasons nobody could fully explain, the small crowd that had gathered outside the general store shifted just enough to make a narrow path, without anyone actually saying a word. Sheriff Howard Pike noticed the movement first. His eyes slid past Clara Whitmore and settled on the tall cowboy approaching from the boardwalk. Elias did not hurry. His sand-colored duster moved lightly in the breeze, and the red bandana at his collar stirred against the faded cloth like a small signal flag that nobody in Dry Creek had thought to read before now. One deputy, Luke Mercer, glanced at the stranger and frowned as if trying to place a memory that would not quite surface. The other deputy simply kept hold of the cuffs, waiting for the sheriff's nod. Clara Whitmore watched the cowboy approach without speaking. The sunlight brushed across her green-brown eyes, and the faint freckles on her cheeks stood out beneath the prairie dust. She did not look relieved. She did not look frightened. Instead, she looked almost certain of something that the rest of the street had not yet begun to understand. Sheriff Pike straightened his vest and shifted his weight the way men do when they expect authority to carry the moment for them. "This does not concern you, cowboy," he said, his voice calm but edged with the kind of impatience that had ruled Dry Creek for years. Elias Carter stopped about 10 feet away, close enough now that the crowd could see the weathered lines in his face and the thin scar that crossed his left eyebrow like an old trail mark. His gray-blue eyes moved from the cuffs in the deputy's hand to Clara's calm posture, and then finally to the sheriff. He still had not spoken. The wind slid down the street again, carrying the dry scent of sage and horse leather from the hitching rail. Somewhere a loose shutter tapped against a frame with a slow, hollow rhythm. Sheriff Pike exhaled through his nose and gave a short laugh meant for the crowd. "If you were passing through town," he said, "you might consider doing just that." A few people shifted nervously. Everyone in Dry Creek knew how quickly the sheriff's patience could disappear. Elias rested his gloved hand against the side of his coat and tilted his head slightly, as if measuring the moment rather than reacting to it. Deputy Luke Mercer leaned toward Pike and murmured quietly, "Sheriff, I think I might have seen this man somewhere." Pike waved the thought away without looking. "You have seen 1,000 cowboys," he replied under his breath. Clara's eyes flicked once more toward Elias, the smallest motion anyone could have missed if they blinked at the wrong time. It was not a plea. It was something closer to recognition. Elias Carter finally spoke, and his voice carried low and steady across the dusty street. "Morning, Sheriff." The words were simple, but the tone behind them held the kind of calm that men learn only after years of walking into places where trouble had already decided to wait. Pike studied him more carefully now. "Morning," the sheriff answered slowly. "You planning to interfere with lawful business in my town?" Elias shook his head once. "No, sir." The answer seemed to relax a few shoulders in the crowd. Sheriff Pike gave a satisfied nod toward his deputies. "Good," he said. "Then we will finish here." The deputy lifted the cuffs again, the metal catching a bright line of sunlight as he stepped toward Clara Whitmore. And that was the moment Elias Carter slipped one hand inside his coat. Not quickly, not dramatically, just the quiet motion of a man reaching for something he had carried a very long time, while the entire street of Dry Creek suddenly leaned forward without realizing they had done so. The street seemed to hold its breath as Elias Carter's gloved hand remained inside his coat for a moment longer than anyone expected, the kind of quiet pause that makes a man suddenly aware of every small sound around him. The creak of saddle leather from the hitching rail, the faint clatter of a wagon wheel rolling somewhere beyond the general store, the whisper of prairie wind sliding between the wooden buildings of Dry Creek. Deputy Luke Mercer slowed his step toward Clara Whitmore, the cuffs still raised in his hand, but his attention had shifted entirely to the tall cowboy standing 10 feet away. Sheriff Howard Pike noticed the hesitation and frowned. "Go on," he said sharply, though not loud enough to break the strange calm settling across the street. Clara Whitmore stood exactly where she had been since the beginning, shoulders relaxed, chin slightly lifted, the sunlight brushing across the small freckles on her cheeks. She watched Elias Carter with steady eyes, not as someone waiting to be rescued, but as someone who already knew how the moment would end. Elias moved at last. Slowly, carefully, he drew his hand back out of the inside pocket of his duster. Something small rested between his fingers, something made of polished silver that caught the morning sun in a sudden sharp glint. The light flashed once across the dusty street like a spark striking flint. Deputy Mercer froze. The cuffs in his hand lowered an inch without him realizing it. Sheriff Pike's eyes narrowed. "What is that supposed to be?" he asked, though. His voice had already begun to lose the certainty it carried only seconds earlier. Elias Carter lifted the small silver piece just high enough for the sheriff to see it clearly. The object turned slightly in the sunlight, revealing the engraved star and the worn lettering around its edge. For a moment nobody spoke. Even the wind seemed to quiet as if the prairie itself had leaned closer to listen. A murmur moved through the people gathered along the boardwalk. The barber squinted from his doorway. The wagon driver removed his hat slowly, as though respect had arrived before explanation. Deputy Mercer took a half step backward. "Sheriff," he said quietly, "that looks like a federal badge." Sheriff Pike did not answer immediately. His gaze remained fixed on the silver star held calmly in Elias Carter's steady hand. The sunlight glinted again across the engraving, revealing the clear words that every lawman in the territory recognized even from a distance of several yards. United States Marshal. Elias lowered the badge slightly, but did not hide it. His gray-blue eyes rested on the sheriff with the calm patience of a man who had seen many towns and many moments just like this one. "Morning, Sheriff Pike," he said in the same steady tone as before. "My name is Elias Carter." The sheriff swallowed once, the movement visible even from across the street. The authority he had carried all morning now seemed to shift uneasily beneath the weight of that small silver star. Clara Whitmore watched the exchange without surprise, her expression unchanged except for the faintest hint of relief passing through her eyes like sunlight breaking through thin cloud. Sheriff Pike finally cleared his throat. "Marshal," he said carefully, as if testing the word before trusting it, "this is local business." Elias Carter nodded once, respectful but unmoved. "I understand that," he replied calmly. "But when local business begins with the wrong accusation, sometimes it becomes federal business." The crowd fell completely silent now, because in Dry Creek everyone suddenly realized that the morning had turned into something far larger than a simple arrest, and the man they had all mistaken for just another dusty cowboy might be the one person in the entire territory who could decide how the story truly ended. The silver star rested quietly in Elias Carter's hand, catching the sunlight with a calm authority that seemed to weigh more than every word spoken on that dusty street so far. Sheriff Howard Pike did not move at first. The confidence that had filled his voice only minutes earlier now lingered somewhere behind his eyes, uncertain and calculating. Around them the town of Dry Creek stood still, as if the wind itself had stopped to listen. Deputy Luke Mercer lowered the iron cuffs slowly, the metal no longer shining like a symbol of power but hanging loosely in his hand, as though it had suddenly become the wrong tool for the wrong moment. Clara Whitmore remained where she stood, the soft prairie wind brushing strands of her chestnut-brown hair across her shoulders while the green and brown in her eyes reflected the morning light. She did not smile. She did not speak. But the tension that had surrounded her a few minutes earlier had begun to shift away like dust blown from a long road. Sheriff Pike finally stepped forward one careful pace, studying the badge again, as if hoping the sunlight had played a trick on him. "You are a long way from a federal court, Marshal," he said slowly, trying to recover the steady tone he was known for in Dry Creek. Elias Carter slipped the badge back toward his coat, but did not hide it completely, leaving the silver star visible enough that no one would mistake the authority behind it. His gray-blue eyes stayed calm, the same steady gaze that had crossed deserts and mountains long before arriving in this small prairie town. "That is true," Elias said quietly. "But the law travels farther than most people expect. That may not legally belong to her," he said, choosing his words with more care than earlier. Elias listened without interrupting. The prairie wind brushed the edge of his worn Stetson, revealing the small bullet hole in the left brim that marked a life lived far beyond the quiet streets of Dry Creek. "That ranch was purchased from Margaret Hale," Clara said calmly, speaking for the first time since the badge appeared. Her voice carried clearly across the street, steady and confident. "The papers were signed 6 months ago in Silver Junction." Sheriff Pike frowned slightly, now hanging low near his belt instead of raised for an arrest. Clara remained calm, her shoulders straight and her hands relaxed at her sides, the soft wind moving a strand of chestnut hair across the small freckle just below her right eye. She watched Sheriff Pike the same way a rancher watches a distant storm across open land, patient and certain that the sky would eventually decide what it intended to do. Pike cleared his throat again, though the sound seemed less commanding than before. "Even if those papers were recorded in Silver Junction," he said slowly, "land disputes are still handled by the local authority first." Elias Carter listened without interrupting, his gray-blue eyes steady beneath the brim of his worn Stetson. "The truth. The ranch is about 12 miles north of here," Clara added quietly. "You could ride there and back before sunset." The suggestion hung in the air like a distant bell ringing across open prairie. Sheriff Pike looked from Clara to Elias, and then slowly across the watching faces of Dry Creek. The town had gathered expecting to see a quick arrest. Instead, they were witnessing something far more uncomfortable for a man used to unquestioned authority. Finally, Pike exhaled and nodded once, the gesture small but noticeable. "Miles north of the creek crossing," she replied. "The road runs straight once you pass the cottonwood grove." A few people from the crowd stepped quietly aside as the sheriff and his deputies untied their horses. Leather straps creaked softly and iron stirrups clinked against saddles that had seen many miles of prairie riding. Elias Carter walked toward his own horse, a tall bay gelding standing a little apart from the others. The animal lifted its head when he approached, recognizing the familiar rhythm of his boots. Elias placed a gloved hand against the horse's neck for a brief moment before swinging easily into the saddle. The motion was smooth and practiced, the kind that comes from years spent crossing open country under wide skies. Steady silence as the town faded farther behind them with every mile. Sheriff Howard Pike rode at the front, his horse stepping carefully over the uneven ground while his eyes remained fixed on the horizon, as if the answer to the entire morning might somehow appear in the distance. Behind him the two deputies followed, their saddles creaking softly with each rise and fall of the trail. Clara Whitmore rode beside them, her posture relaxed but confident, guiding her chestnut mare with the easy control of someone who had spent years working the open land north of the creek. The prairie stretched wide on both sides, broken only by scattered cottonwood trees and the faint shimmer of a small stream cutting through the grass nearly half a mile away. The wind carried the scent of dry earth and distant sagebrush, a familiar smell to anyone who had lived long enough on the frontier to understand how quiet the land could become when something important was unfolding. Elias Carter rode a short distance behind the others, his tall bay gelding moving at a calm, even pace. From that position, he watched everything without needing to speak, the sheriff's posture, the deputies' quiet exchanges, and the steady confidence in Clara Whitmore's riding that suggested she knew every bend of this trail by memory alone. After several miles the road dipped gently toward the creek crossing Clara had mentioned earlier that morning. A narrow band of cottonwood trees lined the water, their leaves flickering silver and green as the breeze moved through them. The horses slowed naturally as they stepped down the shallow bank and splashed across the clear stream, water rippling around their hooves before settling again in smooth circles. On the far side of the creek the land rose slightly, and the trail straightened toward a distant ridge where a cluster of wooden buildings finally appeared against the open sky. Sheriff Pike noticed the ranch first and pulled his horse to a slower walk. The main house stood on a low rise overlooking a wide stretch of grazing land, its weathered boards glowing softly under the sun. A long fence line stretched across the pasture, and a red barn stood to the east beside a small windmill, turning lazily above a water trough. A handful of cattle moved slowly through the grass, their dark shapes casting long shadows across the field. The hitching post and brushed a bit of dust from her skirt before turning toward the house. Sheriff Pike dismounted a moment later, his boots hitting the ground with a dull thud that seemed louder now that the prairie wind had settled into a softer afternoon hush. Deputy Luke Mercer and the second deputy followed, tying their horses beside the others while glancing around the ranch with the curious attention of men who were beginning to see something that did not match the accusation they had ridden out to prove. Dry Creek shortly after, she replied. She moved south to live with her sister in Carson Valley. The sheriff glanced down again at the registry seal, and then toward the front window where the wide pasture rolled away beneath the afternoon sun. The ranch looked different now that the truth had settled into the room. It was no longer a piece of land under suspicion, but the home of someone who had worked quietly to build something honest on the frontier. Deputy Mercer finally straightened and looked toward Sheriff Pike. If the registry stamp is real, the land office in Silver Junction would have the same record, he said slowly. Sheriff Pike nodded without taking his eyes from the document. The weight of the morning's ride seemed to settle across his shoulders as he folded the parchment carefully and placed it back beneath the brass star paperweight on the table. For a long moment he said nothing at all, and the quiet inside the Whitmore ranch house carried the kind of stillness that comes when a man begins to realize that the story he believed might never have been the truth in the first place. The quiet inside the Whitmore ranch house lingered after Sheriff Howard Pike placed the folded document back beneath the brass star paperweight, as though the room itself understood the meaning of what had just been read. Afternoon sunlight drifted through the windows and settled across the wooden table, illuminating the pale grain of the boards and the edge of the parchment that now rested safely beneath the small weight. Sheriff Pike stood still for a moment with both hands resting against the table, his gaze fixed on the paper as if it might reveal something new if he studied it long enough. The deputies exchanged a brief glance behind him, their earlier confidence replaced with a careful patience that came from realizing the situation had changed more than anyone expected. Clara Whitmore remained beside the chair where she had been standing all along, calm and steady in the quiet room, her posture relaxed but dignified in the way of someone who had already known the truth before the ride from Dry Creek ever began. Outside the open window, the slow-turning blades of the windmill creaked softly in the breeze, and the distant cattle moved across the pasture in small clusters beneath the pale afternoon.